My mother leaned toward a guest at the front row of my wedding and whispered loud enough for half the church to hear. Some celebrations shouldn't happen this late in life. That was the moment I realized my parents had not come to bless my marriage. They had come to bury it. When the church doors opened that afternoon, sunlight spilled across the polished wooden floor, and every head turned to watch the guests arrive. My friends were soft pastels. My husband Daniel's family had chosen warm spring colors, light blue ties, cream dresses, pale pink shawls. The entire room looked like a painting of quiet happiness. And then my parents walked in. My father, Robert Carter, wore a black suit darker than any I had ever seen him wear before, paired with a black tie. My mother, Linda Carter, followed beside him in a long black dress and matching gloves, the kind someone might wear to a formal funeral service. For a second I thought maybe they had come straight from another event. Maybe there was some innocent explanation. But when my mother reached the aisle and glanced up at me standing beside Daniel at the altar, her lips tightened into a thin line that carried no joy at all. Guests began whispering softly to one another. Even the wedding coordinator paused near the back of the church as if something about the scene felt wrong. I felt Daniel's hand close gently around mine. His thumb brushed the side of my fingers once, calm and steady, the way he always did when he sensed I was about to lose my balance emotionally. Daniel Brooks had a way of bringing quiet to chaos. At 70 years old, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize storms before they arrived. But even he seemed surprised by what he was seeing. My parents slowly took their seats in the second row. My mother folded her hands neatly over her purse. My father crossed one leg over the other and stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. No smiles. No congratulations. Not even a polite nod toward the groom's family sitting beside them. It felt less like they were attending a wedding and more like they were witnessing a verdict they had already decided. I tried to focus on the music from the string quartet, drifting softly through the church. I tried to focus on the flowers lining the aisle, white lilies and pale roses that Daniel had insisted on choosing himself because he said they reminded him of the garden my late husband and I had once planted behind our old house. I told myself that today was about starting a new chapter, about hope, about courage. But then my mother leaned slightly toward a woman seated beside her, someone from Daniel's extended family, and spoke again in that same low voice that somehow still carried through the quiet church. Second weddings at her age are unfortunate. The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A few heads turned. My chest tightened, but I kept my eyes forward. I had spent most of my life learning how to remain calm when my parents disapproved of my choices. They had mastered the art of control long before I ever learned the courage to challenge it. And yet, as I stood there in my wedding dress, holding the hand of a man who had given me more kindness in 3 years than I had received in decades, I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to admit before. My parents had not come to celebrate my happiness. They had come to make sure everyone in that room knew they believed this marriage should never have happened. The ceremony continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But the air inside the church had changed. It was subtle, like the quiet shift before a summer storm. The string quartet played softly, the same gentle melody we had rehearsed the night before, yet the music no longer felt light. I could sense the attention drifting behind us, guests glancing toward the second row where my parents sat like two dark shadows in the middle of a bright afternoon. Daniel leaned slightly closer to me while the officiant spoke about commitment and partnership. His voice remained steady, but I noticed the way his eyes moved briefly across the room, measuring the atmosphere the way a careful man always does. Daniel had spent 30 years as a judge before he retired. He had learned how to read a room without asking a single question. I followed his gaze for just a moment and saw my father sitting with his arms folded tightly across his chest. My mother had not moved at all. Her posture was perfectly straight, her chin lifted, her expression composed in that familiar way she used whenever she believed she was witnessing someone make a terrible mistake. I had seen that expression many times growing up. When I chose a college she did not approve of. When I moved to another state for my first job. When I married my late husband, Thomas, despite their quiet insistence that I could do better. For 67 years my parents had treated every decision I made as something temporary, something they expected to correct eventually. Even after Thomas passed away 5 years earlier, They had continued to behave as though my life belonged to them again. Daniel squeezed my hand once more as the officiant invited us to exchange vows. His warmth steadied me. I focused on the words we had written together at our kitchen table 3 weeks earlier, sitting beside the window that overlooked the lake behind his house. Daniel had insisted that we keep our vows simple and honest. No dramatic promises, no elaborate speeches. Just truth. I promised him patience. I promised him loyalty. I promised that I would never allow fear to keep me from choosing happiness again. When Daniel spoke his vows, his voice carried through the quiet church with calm confidence. He promised to protect my peace, to share every ordinary day with kindness, and to remind me that love did not have an expiration date simply because society believed it should. Several guests smiled softly. Someone in the back of the room even wiped away a tear. But when I glanced again toward the second row, my parents remained completely still. No reaction. No warmth. Only that same dark clothing and silent judgment, sitting like a stain in the middle of our celebration. The officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, and the room filled with polite applause as Daniel kissed my cheek. It was not a dramatic moment, just a quiet gesture filled with respect and affection. We turned to face our friends and family as the music shifted to a brighter melody, signaling the beginning of the walk back down the aisle. For a few seconds I allowed myself to breathe again. Perhaps the worst part was over. Perhaps my parents would remain silent, and the rest of the evening could continue peacefully. But as Daniel and I began walking down the aisle together, I heard my mother speak once more, her voice calm and certain. "This will not last," she said softly, as though she were commenting on the weather. Several guests nearby turned their heads in surprise. Daniel did not stop walking, but I felt his hand tighten slightly around mine. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully understood before. My parents were not simply disapproving of my marriage. They were waiting for it to fail. I heard those words echo in my mind long after the church doors closed behind us. "This will not last." My mother had said it with the same calm certainty she used whenever she predicted rain on a clear morning. For her it was not cruelty. It was simply conviction. Daniel and I stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight while guests gathered along the stone steps of the church, smiling and holding up their phones to capture photographs. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh grass from the park across the street. Someone laughed near the flower arrangements, and the photographer called for everyone to stand closer together. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way a wedding should look. But inside me something felt unsettled. Daniel noticed it immediately. He always did. While the photographer arranged our families into position, Daniel leaned closer and spoke quietly, so only I could hear him. "Do not worry about them today," he said gently. "This day belongs to us." I nodded, though my eyes drifted toward the edge of the crowd where my parents stood several feet apart from the others. My father had removed his jacket and folded it neatly over his arm, but the black tie still hung stiffly against his white shirt. My mother kept her gloves on even though the afternoon sun had grown warmer. They looked like visitors attending the wrong event. When the photographer called for the family portrait, Daniel's son Michael and his wife Olivia stepped forward beside us with easy smiles. They had welcomed me into their lives from the very beginning. Michael placed a supportive hand on Daniel's shoulder while Olivia adjusted the bouquet in my hands. But my parents hesitated. They approached slowly, as though stepping into something they did not entirely approve of. My mother stood at the far edge of the group, leaving a noticeable space between herself and the rest of the family. The photographer tried twice to move everyone closer together. My mother did not budge. The camera flashed several times while polite smiles held the moment together. After the photographs ended, guests began walking toward the reception hall 2 blocks away, where dinner and music were waiting. Daniel slipped his arm through mine as we followed the crowd along the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, and the sound of quiet conversation filled the air. For a few minutes it felt peaceful again. But as we approached the entrance to the reception hall, I noticed something strange. My parents had not joined the others inside. Instead, they stood near the parking lot speaking quietly with a man I did not recognize. He was tall, wearing a gray jacket, and he kept glancing toward the entrance of the hall, as if checking whether anyone was watching. My father spoke with sharp movements of his hands while my mother listened with the same tight expression she had worn all afternoon. Daniel followed my gaze and studied the scene for a few seconds. Then he gave a small, thoughtful nod, almost as if he had just confirmed something he had already suspected. "Come inside," he said calmly, guiding me toward the doors. "Dinner is waiting, and our guests are ready to celebrate." I looked back one more time before stepping inside the reception hall. The man in the gray jacket had already turned away, walking quickly toward the far end of the parking lot. My parents remained standing together in silence. And although the music from inside the hall had already begun to play, I had the sudden uneasy feeling that whatever they had planned for this evening had not finished unfolding yet. The reception hall glowed with warm lights and quiet music as guests began filling the long round tables arranged across the polished wooden floor. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers above, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen doors at the back of the room. It was the kind of place designed for celebration, the kind of place where laughter usually arrived easily. Yet when Daniel and I stepped inside, I still carried the uneasy image of my parents standing in the parking lot with that stranger. In the gray jacket, Daniel guided me toward the center of the room, where our table stood near the small stage that held the band equipment and the large projection screen behind it. Olivia greeted us first, her smile bright and genuine as she adjusted the place cards on the table. "Everything looks beautiful," she said warmly. Michael lifted his glass of water in a quiet toast. "You two look like the happiest couple in the room." Daniel thanked them both, his calm voice steady as always. If he had noticed the strange meeting outside, he did not show it. But I knew Daniel well enough to recognize the subtle signs of his thinking. He had grown quieter, more observant, the way he often became when he sensed that something important was unfolding just beneath the surface. Guests slowly settled into their seats while soft jazz music played through the speakers. Waiters moved between the tables filling glasses and setting down baskets of bread. For several minutes, I allowed myself to focus on the simple joy of the moment. Friends leaned across tables, sharing stories. Someone near the back of the room laughed loudly at a joke. The tension from earlier in the church seemed to fade into the background like a storm moving farther away. Then the doors opened again. My parents entered the hall together, still dressed in black, their expressions unchanged. Conversations softened for a moment as several guests noticed them walking slowly across the room. They did not greet anyone. They did not congratulate us. They simply took their seats at a table near the edge of the hall. I noticed that my mother placed her purse carefully on the table and removed a small envelope from inside it before slipping the purse back onto her lap. She rested one gloved hand on top of the envelope as if guarding it. Something about the gesture felt deliberate. Daniel noticed it too. His eyes moved briefly toward their table, studying the scene with quiet attention before returning to me. "Enjoy the evening," he said softly. "Everything is unfolding exactly the way it should." His words surprised me. There was confidence in his voice, the same calm certainty he used when delivering a final decision from the bench during his years as a judge. Before I could ask what he meant, the bandleader stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone. The room gradually fell silent as guests turned their chairs toward the front. "Ladies and gentlemen," the bandleader said with a cheerful smile, "we would like to invite everyone to raise a glass for our newly married couple." Glasses lifted around the room, sparkling under the chandelier lights. Daniel stood beside me and placed a gentle hand at the small of my back. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother glance down at the envelope again, her fingers tightening around its edge. My father leaned slightly toward her and whispered something that made her nod once in quiet agreement. At that moment, I realized that whatever was inside that envelope had been brought here for a reason. And judging by the calm look on Daniel's face, I had the growing feeling that he already knew exactly what that reason was. The glasses slowly lowered after the toast, and the quiet murmur of conversation returned to the room. Dinner began soon after, with waiters moving gracefully between tables while plates of roasted chicken, green beans, and warm bread were placed in front of each guest. The band continued playing soft background music, and the atmosphere slowly warmed as people began talking again. From the outside, the reception looked exactly the way a wedding celebration should look. But my attention kept drifting back to my parents' table across the room. My mother still had that envelope resting under her hand, as if it were something fragile or important. Every few minutes she glanced toward Daniel and me, her expression calm but focused. My father leaned back in his chair, occasionally whispering something to her while scanning the room with careful eyes. They were not participating in the celebration. They were waiting. Daniel noticed it too. He remained relaxed beside me, speaking easily with Michael and Olivia, yet every now and then his gaze quietly returned to the same table. Finally, I leaned slightly closer to him. "Do you know what they are planning?" I asked softly. Daniel took a slow sip of water before answering. "I have a feeling," he said calmly. His voice carried no worry, only quiet certainty. That answer left me more curious than before. Across the room, my mother suddenly straightened in her chair as the band finished another song. The room grew quieter again when the bandleader stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced cheerfully, "we will soon open the floor for a few words from family members who would like to share a toast with the newly married couple." I noticed my mother glance immediately toward the stage. Her hand tightened slightly around the envelope. My father gave a small approving nod. The movement was subtle, but it confirmed what Daniel had already suspected. My parents had not brought that envelope for sentimental reasons. They had brought it for this moment. Olivia leaned toward me with a warm smile. "I hope someone tells a funny story," she whispered. "Wedding toasts are always better when they make people laugh." I smiled politely, though a quiet tension had returned to my chest. The bandleader continued speaking. "If anyone would like to share a few words, please come forward." For a few seconds no one moved. Then my mother slowly stood from her chair. Her black dress seemed even darker under the chandelier lights as she walked carefully toward the stage, the envelope now clearly visible in her hand. Conversations faded as guests noticed her approaching the microphone. Daniel watched calmly beside me, his posture completely relaxed. My mother reached the front of the room and unfolded the envelope with deliberate care. The thin sheet of paper inside caught the light as she placed it on the small podium. She looked out across the room at all the guests, then finally at Daniel and me standing together beside the stage. Her expression was not angry. It was confident, like someone who believed they were about to reveal an important truth. "I would like to say a few words," she began, her voice steady and clear. The room grew completely silent. I could feel every eye turning toward us as she lifted the paper in her hand. And in that moment I realized that whatever she was about to read had been planned long before this wedding day ever began. My mother stood at the microphone with the calm confidence of someone who believed the entire room was about to agree with her. She adjusted the paper in her hands and cleared her throat gently before speaking again. "As the bride's mother," she began, her voice carrying easily through the quiet hall, "I feel it is my responsibility to share something important with everyone here today." Several guests shifted in their seats. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the room only minutes earlier slowly faded into an uneasy silence. I felt Daniel's hand rest lightly against my back again, steady and reassuring. My mother lifted the sheet of paper slightly higher and continued. "A wedding is supposed to celebrate honesty, trust, and wise decisions. Unfortunately, sometimes people make choices without fully understanding the consequences." A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. Michael frowned slightly at our table, while Olivia leaned forward as if trying to understand where this speech was going. My father remained seated near the edge of the room, watching quietly with his hands folded together. My mother's voice remained composed as she looked directly at me. "My daughter has always been an emotional person. She has often rushed into decisions that later proved difficult." She paused, allowing her words to settle over the room like a thin cloud. Then she raised the paper again. "This document," she said carefully, "is information I felt the guests here deserved to know before celebrating this marriage." My heart tightened as I watched her unfold the sheet completely. For a moment, I wondered what kind of accusation she believed she was about to reveal. My mother had always believed she was protecting me, even when her actions felt more like control than concern. She took a slow breath and began reading from the page. "According to financial records that I obtained earlier this month, my daughter has recently made several decisions regarding her estate that could place her future security at risk." A quiet murmur moved through the room. Guests glanced toward me with curiosity, some with concern. My mother continued calmly. "These decisions involve transferring certain financial responsibilities and property access to Daniel Brooks." She lowered the paper slightly and looked directly at Daniel, "a man who has been part of our family for less than 3 years." The words hung in the air. For a moment, I felt the entire room holding its breath. My mother seemed satisfied that she had captured everyone's attention. Before everyone here celebrates, she added firmly. I believe it is only fair that people understand exactly what this marriage might cost my daughter. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Someone at a nearby table quietly set down their glass. But beside me, Daniel did not react with surprise or anger. Instead, he simply looked toward the stage with the calm expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for quite some time. He waited until my mother finished her sentence before stepping forward slightly. Then he leaned toward the bandleader and said something quietly that only the man beside him could hear. The bandleader nodded once and walked toward the sound table at the back of the stage. My mother noticed the movement immediately. She paused in the middle of her speech, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. And in that quiet moment, before anyone understood what Daniel had just set in motion, the large projection screen behind the stage flickered softly to life. The sudden glow from the large projection screen behind the stage pulled every eye in the room away from my mother and toward the wall of light. She stopped reading mid-sentence, the paper still lifted in her hand. The bandleader stepped quietly away from the sound table as the screen brightened fully. For a moment, nothing appeared except a blank white background. The room remained completely silent. My mother turned slightly, clearly irritated by the interruption. "What is this?" she asked sharply, glancing toward Daniel. Daniel did not answer immediately. He simply stepped forward beside me with the same calm expression he had carried all evening. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady and respectful. "I believe if we are sharing information with our guests tonight," he said evenly, "it is only fair that everyone hears the entire story." A faint ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs. My mother lowered the paper slightly, but did not step away from the microphone. Her eyes moved from Daniel to the glowing screen behind her. Then the first image appeared. It was a video recording. The camera angle looked as though it had been taken from across a parking lot, slightly elevated, capturing the front entrance of a small office building. A quiet timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. I recognized the location immediately. It was the financial advisory office on Maple Avenue, the same place Daniel and I had visited 3 weeks earlier to review my estate documents. The video continued for a few seconds before two familiar figures appeared walking into frame. My parents. My mother and father approached the office door together, speaking quietly to a man standing beside them. Even from across the reception hall, I could see my mother's posture stiffen as the realization settled in. The man in the video was the same tall figure I had noticed earlier in the parking lot outside the reception hall, the one wearing the gray jacket. The video had no sound at first, only the silent motion of the three of them speaking together before entering the building. Then the audio began, the room filled with the clear recording of their voices. My father spoke first. "We just need confirmation of her assets," he said calmly in the recording. "Those decisions later." My father nodded slowly in the video. "That is exactly what we are trying to avoid," he replied. "She has worked her entire life for what she has. We do not want some man walking away with it." A quiet murmur spread through the reception hall as guests processed the conversation. At the front of the room, my mother still held the microphone, but her hand had lowered slightly as if she had forgotten she was even holding it. The video continued. My mother leaned forward in the recording, her voice firm and deliberate. "We just need something official. Something that shows this marriage is financially irresponsible." The man in the gray jacket nodded again. "Then you will want a financial statement and a legal opinion. If you present it publicly, it can raise questions." Back in the reception hall, several guests exchanged uneasy looks. Olivia covered her mouth briefly, clearly shocked. Michael sat perfectly still beside her, watching the screen with narrowed eyes. I felt Daniel's presence beside me, calm and steady, as though this moment had been expected all along. On the screen, the man in the gray jacket gathered the papers together and slid one document toward my parents. "This is a summary of her current assets," he explained. "If you read it at the right moment, it could create enough doubt to delay any transfers." My mother in the recording lifted the page and scanned it carefully. "Perfect," she said quietly. "That will be exactly what we need for the wedding." The room seemed to grow even quieter as those words echoed through the speakers. A few guests turned slowly toward the real version of my mother standing beside the stage. Her face had gone pale beneath the chandelier lights. My father shifted slightly in his chair across the room, his eyes now fixed on the floor rather than the screen. The video paused for a moment before continuing again with another short clip. This time the camera showed the same parking lot outside the office building. My parents and the man in the gray jacket stood beside a black sedan. My mother's voice carried clearly through the recording. Once everyone hears the numbers, they will understand why this marriage is a mistake. The man in the gray jacket gave a small approving smile. Public pressure works better than private arguments. The recording ended with that final sentence. The screen faded slowly to black, leaving the room in complete silence once again. At the front of the hall, my mother finally lowered the microphone entirely, the envelope and paper now hanging loosely at her side. Daniel stepped forward calmly, his voice steady but gentle as he addressed the room. "I believe," he said quietly, "that everyone here now understands why we felt it was important to share the full context of tonight's speech." And for the first time since the evening had begun, every eye in the room was no longer questioning our marriage. They were questioning the people who had tried to stop it. The silence after the screen faded to black felt heavier than any speech that had been spoken that evening. For several long seconds, no one in the reception hall moved. Glasses remained untouched on the tables, and the soft music that had been playing earlier had completely stopped. My mother stood beside the microphone with the paper still in her hand, but the confidence that had carried her onto the stage had disappeared. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the faces of the guests who were now watching her with quiet disbelief. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair near the back table, his posture no longer relaxed. He reached for his water glass, but stopped halfway, as though suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. Daniel remained beside me, calm and steady, his expression respectful rather than confrontational. That was always Daniel's way. He never needed to raise his voice to make a point. The truth, once visible, spoke loudly enough on its own. My mother cleared her throat softly, attempting to regain control of the moment. "This recording," she said carefully into the microphone, "does not show the full picture." Her voice was still composed, but there was a strain beneath it now, the kind that appears when someone realizes their plan has begun to unravel. She lifted the paper slightly again, as if trying to return to the speech she had prepared earlier. But the room no longer felt the same. The attention that had once been curious had now turned cautious. People were no longer waiting to hear accusations about Daniel or my financial decisions. They were waiting to understand why my parents had been secretly gathering documents in the first place. My mother hesitated before continuing. "Our only intention," she said slowly, "was to protect our daughter." A few guests shifted in their chairs. The explanation sounded less convincing now that the recording had revealed their private conversation. Daniel stepped forward slightly, not interrupting, but gently acknowledging the moment. "Mrs. Carter," he said respectfully, "I believe everyone here understands that parents often worry about their children. That is natural." His tone remained calm and polite. But then he added quietly, "However, tonight was meant to celebrate a marriage, not question it with incomplete information." My mother's lips pressed together tightly. For the first time that evening, she seemed unsure how to respond. My father finally stood up from his table and walked a few steps closer to the stage. His voice was lower, more restrained. "This is unnecessary," he said quietly. "Family matters should remain private." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the point without argument. "Normally I would agree," he replied. "But when accusations are presented publicly, the truth deserves the same opportunity." Around the room, several guests nodded in quiet agreement. Olivia reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently, her expression filled with sympathy rather than judgment. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching my parents with a thoughtful expression that suggested he had already reached his own conclusion. At the front of the room, my mother slowly folded the paper she had planned to read and slipped it back into the envelope. The speech she had prepared no longer seemed to belong in the room. The confidence that had brought her to the microphone had faded, replaced by a quiet tension that everyone could feel. She looked toward my father briefly, as though seeking guidance. He gave a small shake of his head. Without another word, my mother stepped away from the microphone and turned toward the exit doors at the side of the reception hall. My father followed a moment later. They moved quickly but without speaking, their dark clothing passing through the soft light of the room like shadows leaving the stage. The doors closed behind them with a quiet click. And for the first time that evening, The entire room finally seemed ready to celebrate again. For several seconds after the doors closed behind my parents, the room remained completely still. The tension that had filled the hall all evening slowly began to loosen, like a knot finally coming undone. Guests looked at one another quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others offering small, reassuring smiles in our direction. The bandleader stepped forward uncertainly, glancing toward Daniel as if waiting for permission to continue. Daniel gave him a gentle nod. The bandleader lifted the microphone again and cleared his throat with a small, awkward laugh. "Well," he said lightly, "every wedding has a memorable moment. I believe we just witnessed ours." A few quiet chuckles moved through the crowd. The musicians began playing again, this time a warm, steady melody that slowly brought life back into the room. Conversations returned to the tables, first softly, then with growing comfort as guests realized the tension had passed. Olivia stood and walked over to me with open arms. She wrapped me in a gentle hug that felt both protective and sincere. "You handled that with so much grace," she whispered. Michael followed behind her, offering Daniel a firm handshake and a supportive smile. "I have seen courtroom drama with less composure than that," he joked quietly. Daniel smiled politely, but said nothing. He never seemed interested in victory or embarrassment. For him, the truth simply needed to stand where everyone could see it. I took a slow breath and looked around the reception hall. Only a few minutes earlier the room had felt like a stage for accusations and doubt. Now it slowly returned to the celebration it had always been meant to be. Waiters began moving again between tables, refilling glasses and clearing dinner plates. Guests approached one by one to congratulate us properly, offering warm wishes and kind words. No one mentioned the scene that had just unfolded directly, but their expressions carried quiet understanding. After a few minutes, Daniel gently guided me toward the center of the room, where the small dance floor waited beneath the chandelier lights. The band had shifted to a slower song now, one with a soft piano melody that floated gently through the hall. Daniel turned to face me, his calm eyes meeting mine with that same reassuring warmth that had steadied me throughout the evening. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Brooks?" he asked with a faint smile. The question felt simple, almost ordinary, but after everything that had happened it carried a deeper meaning. I nodded and placed my hand in his. The music swelled slightly as we stepped onto the dance floor together. Around us, guests formed a loose circle, watching quietly as the first dance of the evening finally began. Daniel's hand rested lightly at my back while we moved slowly across the floor. The tension that had followed me since the church ceremony began to fade with each step. I realized then that my parents had spent most of my life trying to shape my decisions through fear and doubt. But tonight something had shifted. Their voices were no longer the loudest ones in the room. As the music continued, Daniel leaned slightly closer and spoke softly enough that only I could hear. Sometimes the truth simply needs the right moment to be heard. I smiled and rested my head gently against his shoulder for a moment as we turned slowly beneath the warm chandelier lights. And for the first time that entire day, the celebration finally felt exactly the way a wedding should feel. The music continued drifting through the reception hall long after our first dance ended, and the atmosphere slowly transformed into the warm, relaxed celebration that Daniel and I had imagined when we first began planning the day. Guests returned to their tables with lighter expressions, and the earlier tension felt like a distant storm that had already passed beyond the horizon. Laughter began appearing again in small pockets around the room. Someone near the back started a quiet conversation about travel plans. Another group gathered around the dessert table where small plates of cake were being served. The ordinary sounds of celebration returned piece by piece, until the room once again felt like a wedding rather than a courtroom. Daniel and I stepped away from the dance floor, and several friends approached us with gentle smiles and supportive words. None of them asked questions about what had happened. Instead, they spoke about the ceremony, about how beautiful the vows had been, about how happy we looked together. Their kindness felt deliberate, as though they understood that sometimes the best way to support someone is not by reopening a difficult moment, but by reminding them that life continues forward. Olivia soon joined us again, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider which she handed to us with a playful grin. "Every wedding needs a proper toast from the people who actually support the couple," she said warmly. Michael stood beside her with his usual thoughtful expression. You handled the evening better than most judges I have seen, he told Daniel with quiet respect. Daniel gave a modest smile, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He preferred calm solutions rather than public victories. After a few minutes, the band shifted to a more upbeat song, and several guests began moving toward the dance floor again. The mood of the room lifted even further as people joined hands, laughing and encouraging one another to dance. The celebration had finally found its rhythm. As the evening continued, I stepped outside for a moment onto the small balcony that overlooked the parking lot. The cool night air carried the faint scent of summer grass and distant traffic from the nearby highway. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to reflect quietly on everything that had happened. My parents had spent most of my life believing they understood what was best for me. Their intentions had often been wrapped in the language of protection, but their actions had always carried the weight of control. Tonight, for the first time, their voices had lost their power over my choices. I heard the balcony door open softly behind me. Daniel stepped outside and joined me, resting his hands gently on the railing beside mine. "You are very quiet," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "I was just thinking about how different this evening could have been." Daniel nodded thoughtfully as he looked out across the quiet parking lot, where only a few cars remained. "Sometimes difficult moments reveal the truth more clearly than peaceful ones," he replied. I glanced toward him. "Did you plan all of that before today?" Daniel paused for a moment before answering honestly. "I hoped we would not need it," he said, "but I believed it was wise to be prepared." His answer made me laugh softly under my breath. That was Daniel in every situation. Calm, patient, and always ready for the unexpected. After a moment, we returned inside together where the music, laughter, and warm lights of the reception hall welcomed us back. The celebration continued long into the evening, filled with dancing, conversations, and quiet joy. And although my parents had chosen to leave earlier, the absence they left behind no longer felt like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something far more peaceful. When we stepped back into the reception hall that night, the celebration had grown warmer and fuller than before, as if the difficult moment earlier had somehow cleared the air rather than darkened it. The dance floor was alive with movement now. Guests laughed as they tried to follow the rhythm of an upbeat song, and the band seemed to play with renewed energy. The soft golden lights above the tables reflected off glasses and silverware, creating a gentle glow that made the entire room feel welcoming again. Daniel and I paused near the entrance for a moment, simply watching the scene unfold. For years I had imagined my wedding day in different ways, but none of those imagined versions had included the complicated path that had led us here tonight. And yet, standing there beside him, I realized that the celebration unfolding in front of us felt more genuine than anything I had once pictured. Olivia soon spotted us and waved us back toward the dance floor with enthusiastic determination. "You cannot hide out there all evening," she called playfully. Michael laughed beside her and joined the invitation with a small bow toward the center of the room. Daniel glanced at me with that familiar calm smile and extended his hand again. I accepted it without hesitation, and together we stepped back into the circle of music and laughter. The rest of the evening unfolded in a gentle rhythm. Friends shared stories about Daniel's years on the bench and about my late husband Thomas, remembering him with kindness and respect. Those memories did not feel heavy or painful. Instead, they felt like threads woven into the long fabric of a life that had brought me to this new chapter. At one point, Michael raised a quiet toast that captured the mood of the entire room. He stood beside his chair, lifting his glass with a thoughtful expression. "Every family story has its complicated chapters," he said warmly. "But tonight reminds us that the next chapter can still be written with hope." Glasses lifted around the tables in quiet agreement. Daniel and I thanked him with grateful smiles. Later in the evening, the band slowed the music again, and several couples moved gently across the dance floor under the chandelier lights. I noticed how easily Daniel spoke with each guest who approached him, offering the same calm respect to everyone. That was one of the qualities that have set a new standard for unexpected moments. Daniel smiled at that and turned to face me. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked calmly. The question hung in the quiet air for a moment, but the answer came easily. "No," I said without hesitation. "Not even a little. For most of my life, I had allowed other voices to shape the boundaries of my choices. My parents had always believed they were guiding me, but their guidance often came wrapped in doubt and control. Tonight had been the first time those patterns had been exposed clearly in front of others. Instead of weakening the celebration, the truth had simply made everything clearer. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then the evening accomplished exactly what it needed to accomplish, he said. We both stood quietly for a moment longer, letting the peaceful silence settle around us. In the distance, I noticed the empty stretch of road leading away from the hall where my parents had driven earlier. For years I had imagined that their approval was something I needed in order to move forward confidently. But now, standing there beside the man I had chosen for myself, I realized something important. Peace does not come from pleasing everyone who questions your decisions. Peace comes from finally trusting your own. Daniel opened the passenger door for me with the same quiet courtesy he showed in every small gesture. As I settled into the seat, I took one last look back toward the reception hall. The building stood dark and silent now, its windows reflecting the soft glow of the street lamps. Only a few hours earlier it had been filled with music, laughter, and the unexpected moment that had revealed more truth than anyone had anticipated. Daniel started the engine, and the car rolled slowly out of the parking lot. As we drove down the quiet street together, I felt a calm certainty that had not been there before. The complicated chapter of my life, shaped by fear and hesitation, had quietly come to an end that evening. And ahead of us, stretching forward beneath the gentle glow of the streetlights, was something far simpler and far stronger. A future built on honesty, respect, and the freedom to choose happiness without asking anyone's permission.